Thank you. Now, moving on to our third and final speaker this afternoon, let me share with you how we came across Catlin Tucker. We know that many of our teachers and many of our schools are passionate about the effective use of technology. We spent the last 2 days with a group looking at blended learning. But we recognise there can be challenges with infrastructure, with hardware, as well as questions about how do we use technology in a way that adds value to what we already do in the classroom. So we were saying, who can we bring in? Who is the person? Who is the go-to person? And somebody mentioned Catlin Tucker. And they said not only has she published award-winning books, she also has a top-ranked blog, which means that she blogs every day. So as well as talking about technology, she's obviously mastered it herself. So I'm in awe about that. Catlin has worked with schools around the world. As I said, she has written many books. And her work is very focused on the practicalities. How do you use technology in a way that adds value, that stretches students' thinking and learning, and is a way of developing the type of 21st century thinker and learner and citizen of the world that we know we wanted to develop. We are enormously thrilled that Catlin was able to come over and join us. She did say to me earlier that she is missing her 9-year-old and her 11-year-old a little bit back home in California. So we're delighted that she was able to join us. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Catlin Tucker.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here with all of you and to share a little bit about my journey and what I have learned. So I started teaching in 2001. I was 22 years old. And I walked into the classroom with very specific ideas about how a classroom was supposed to operate. Those ideas were informed by my own experiences as a student, and then were reinforced when I got my teaching credential and my master's at the University of California in Santa Barbara. So walking into my classroom, these were my initial thoughts that first year. 1, kids should sit in rows, right? They're easier to control that way. A quiet classroom is an effective classroom. And conversely, if you walked into a loud classroom, that meant the teacher had lost all control. Students in the same class should get the exact same task because it's only fair. Teacher is the person in the room who possesses the knowledge. So it was my job as a 22-year-old, which is laughable, to have all of the answers, to essentially be a fountain of knowledge. And it was my job to grade everything. And if I didn't grade it, kids wouldn't do it. I was really focused in the first 5 years of my career on my role, and really on me, on designing my lessons, getting my classroom ready for students, leading those lessons, and then gathering up everything students had touched so that I could grade it. It will surprise none of the teachers in here that about 5 years in, I had developed a pretty serious caffeine addiction. I was exhausted, and I was so disillusioned with this profession. I had come into teaching imagining this classroom I was going to create. I imagined kids bounding through the door. I pictured us sitting in circles, talking about literature and life. It was going to be amazing. And then it didn't happen. And ultimately, I felt like I was failing. I was failing to create this classroom that I had dreamed about. I was failing to engage my students. And it was in that moment of failure and realizing that I was failing when I started to reassess what I thought I knew about teaching and learning. So for me, I had to figure out, how do I shift the focus in my classroom from me to my students? And it started with a really simple exercise. So as a teacher, I ask this question all the time. I get all of these ideas and I think, how can I fill in the blank? So every time I was tempted to ask this question, I would pause, I would reframe, and I would ask, how can my students? And this simple exercise really helped me to start thinking about the role that my students are playing in our class community. Because I know the person doing the work in the classroom is the person doing the learning in the classroom. And I was doing all of the work, or at least the lion's share of the work in those early years. And I needed to figure out, how do I engage my students? So this is an environment where we are all working together. And that really led me to my interest in blended learning. And you can see a big long definition for blended learning online, but as a practitioner, my focus is really on this idea of active engaged learning online combined with active engaged learning in the classroom. And the goal is to give learners more control over these 4 elements of their learning: time, place, pace, and path. Now, they're not going to control all of them all of the time. And there are many different blended learning models, and each model gives students different degrees of control over these elements of their learning. And when I work with teachers, I am very honest about the fact that at the very heart of blended learning, what is happening is that the control in the classroom is shifting from the teacher to the learner. And for a lot of educators, that's really scary, right? Because we put the learners in charge. It's a totally unfamiliar dynamic for most of us. But what I want to do is move away from how I started teaching, this very kind of linear approach where I came up with the objectives, I decided how we were going to practice, I figured out what assessments were going to look like, I graded work, and I gave it back to students. In that very traditional model, learners are relegated to a passive role. And I want them to be super engaged in every part of the work we do in our classroom. And there's so much talk, as Maria said earlier, about this idea of personalizing learning. But I have come to believe that we cannot personalize learning for kids unless we are willing to partner with them. Our learners have to be a partner in this whole experience that is school. So for me, I want learners to be active agents figuring out what their learning objectives should be. What are my academic and personal goals? What is it that I need from the teacher to develop very specific skill sets? And in this partnership, my job as the educator shifts as well. I am more focused on building learning experiences where kids make key decisions, where they make the meaning, and ultimately that allows me to shift into more of this coaching role, where I am explaining why we're doing this, but I'm also helping kids to really fine-tune their skills. Too often, kids come into classrooms and they get assignments, and teachers will tell them how to go about completing something, and then it's left to the student to actually do it. And my job is to support the doing, to support the process. And blended learning has really allowed me the time and space to do more of that in my classroom. So I want to share with you some examples of what this partnership model looks like. So this is a picture of me in my classroom. It's during a station rotation lesson. So there are a series of stations in the classroom, online and offline, and kids rotate through them. I, in this picture, am leading a teacher-led station. And quite frequently, in these moments, as kids are working, I am giving them real-time feedback, again, to support the process. And I'll be very transparent. In the first handful of years I was a teacher, I spent 90% of my time providing feedback on and assessing finished products. Now my goal is to spend 90% of my time supporting the process, giving feedback during the process so the products are higher quality, so kids are really understanding how to be successful. So in this moment, these students are all working on an essay. And they're in their computers, they're making progress. This is what it looks like from the outside in. If you look at my computer screen, you'll see 7 different tabs open. The 7 tabs of the kids who are sitting around me. And I am jumping in and out of documents, asking questions, providing feedback, linking to resources. My kids know this is going to happen. So whenever they work on a process piece, they realize Tucker is going to be in my document every day that I see her giving feedback. And something interesting happens when you move feedback into the classroom. So here's a screenshot of a student, my student Isaac's paper. And I know it's gonna be hard for some of you in the back to read this, so I'll read it for you. So they were supposed to be done with their introduction paragraph. They knew I was gonna be coming in and editing it. And then they were supposed to be starting their first body paragraph. He's highlighted the strategy he used to start his introduction, and he left me this note. It reads, "This is just a worst case hook." So Isaac knows he needs to have a hook. He also knows I'm going to be in his document, but he knows his hook isn't very good. So he just wants me to know that he knows it's not very good and he's working on it. Now Isaac's progress, his learning, is a conversation. That is what I want. I want it to be a conversation with my learners. The second piece of really pulling kids into a partnership, because if I'm the only one providing feedback, if I'm the only one thinking about their learning, that's not a partnership. I have to get students thinking metacognitively about their learning. And you know what? For those of you who raised your hand at high school, that's where I spent most of my time. Kids don't love doing this. You know why? Because it takes time and they have to think. So building a metacognitive practice in a classroom definitely takes some time and energy on the teacher's part, but it pays out dividends. It's incredible what happens when kids start to think about their learning. So every week, my students spend about 20-25 minutes, sometimes in a station, sometimes on their own, looking at the work they've done that week, selecting specific pieces, thinking about which standards and skills does this piece align to, and looking at what I've done, where would I place myself on a 1 through 4 scale toward mastering this particular skill. Am I a 1? Am I just kind of beginning? Am I a 2? Am I developing? Am I a 3? Am I proficient? Or am I a 4? Am I mastering this skill? So it really forces them to slow down and think about, what are we doing in this class? What skills are these assignments helping us to develop? And where do I see myself as a student in terms of my mastery of this particular skill? And so they reflect in this ongoing assessment document, and not only do they provide a score for themselves, they have to include documentation, pictures, links to their work, and they have to post a reflection explaining, why did you give yourself this particular score on this particular skill? So it really does force that thinking about their thinking, that thinking about their learning. And then what's interesting is in their comments, if they have assessed themselves at a 2, and that's not where they want to be, they can tag me in a comment and they can say, hey Tucker, I'm really struggling to make progress on this skill. What would be really helpful for me as a learner is if we could do X, Y, or Z. They start to advocate for themselves as learners, because I can't possibly know what 32 bodies in a room need from me. There has to be a way for them to communicate their needs, what they want as a learner. I told you I moved feedback into the classroom. I also have students self-assessing their own work in the classroom. But clearly, at the end of a formal piece of writing or a formal assignment, I'm going to be grading something. But instead of collecting a bunch of physical papers or digital papers and then taking them home and spending hours of my time grading them on my own, I have pulled that into the classroom. So traditionally, teachers assign something, students complete it in isolation, they submit it to the teacher takes it home, assesses it in isolation, and there's no opportunity for a conversation. So when I want to assess student work, I pull that process, the entire process, into the classroom. So I will use blended learning models, whether it's the playlist model, the flipped classroom model, the station rotation model, to create the time and space that I need to sit right next to students as I'm assessing their work. And I think one of the things I have learned is so often as educators, I know I felt this pressure in the beginning, we try to grade every single aspect of every single assignment. And when I sit next to students, it's very clear, once I have gone through 2 or 3 different aspects of this assignment, they just start to glaze over. You know, it's like they just hit their limit, they can't take in anymore. So instead, if they're doing a piece of argumentative writing, I might select 2 different criteria, and those are the ones I'm going to assess in that side-by-side conversation. So as I'm looking at their work, I'm doing a talk aloud, so I'm basically everything I'm thinking as I look at it, I'm saying out loud, and then I am literally circling the language on the rubric for those 2 criteria that I think really align with where that student is at. And then at the end of that think aloud grading session, I turn to the student and I ask, do you have any questions? Because if they have questions, I want to make sure I know what those are. If they have things they're stuck on, I might not be able to troubleshoot them in that moment, but I can use that to inform my lesson design in the next week. But I really want them to be able to express, what are you stuck with? What are you not understanding? What do you need from me? And then the last thing I ask them to do is to write in their own words, what's next? What do I want to focus on next based on the conversation I just had? And so when I'm at a very traditional school, I have to spit out an A through F grade every 6 weeks. But the goal with that metacognitive practice of reflecting on their learning is really to incentivize students to go back to pieces, to edit, to rework, to improve them. I don't want the grade to be a carrot. I want it to be constant, continual improvement. So if we're getting close to grade reporting time, my students know if they feel like the grade in the grade book isn't representative of where they are right now, because they've gone back to pieces, they've edited, they've improved, they've spent time online practicing, I want to honor that. So they can actually apply for a grade interview. So they submit a Google form, they ask for a grade interview, they explain what work they have done beyond my assessment scores that they think shows they've really grown and developed as a student, and then they sit side by side with me and they make an argument. And they literally structure it like they would any argument. Here's my claim, this is what I think I deserve in English, here are 3 pieces of evidence from this grading period that support my claim, and we have a conversation about their work. And there's something so powerful in these conversations because students realize grades are no longer something that happen to them. They can be active agents. They can go, they can improve pieces, they can articulate why they believe that their skill sets have grown and improved because they're constantly reflecting on their learning. And again, it really hits home this idea that I'm not trying to just decide on a grade for you. Let's have a conversation about what grade is actually appropriate for you. So, what I have learned. I have learned many, many things that will not fit on this slide, but some of the big takeaways for me in my teaching career have really been that uniformity is easier for me, but it is not what's best for kids. I want students to be active agents. I want them to make key decisions about what and how they learn. Students really should be leading the learning. My goal should not be to control the learners. My goal should be to support the learners in driving the learning. Teachers really, I don't feel any pressure anymore to be a fountain of knowledge. I see my role, if we're talking about metaphors, more as kind of an architect. I build kind of the outline, I come up with the design, but kids actually build. They are the ones who bring the meaning to the learning. And then because I'm not standing up in front of a classroom talking at them, I get to shift into a coaching role where I really am trying to support them throughout the process of developing very specific skills. And then this last piece, that grades should not happen to students. They should not be passive participants in any aspect of school. It's something they should feel that they have agency around, that they can actually play a role in figuring out, like, where am I as a learner? Where are my skills at? What do I need to improve on? Thank you.